I had a conversation with a great physicist, Roger Penrose, and Penrose has this obsession with tiling. So he designs tiles, and he's interested in the mathematics of tiling, and it's in some sense a strange interest. And so, but he's a genius, and so whenever I see a genius and he has a strange interest, I think that's probably related to his genius in some way, because after all, he's a genius. And so I thought a lot about his obsession with tiling. Outside the building he works in at Oxford, the land outside is covered with a tile that he designed that has certain mathematical properties that I don't know enough about to describe in detail. But I was very interested psychologically in the idea of tiling. So imagine that you have a surface, an uneven and rough surface that's very complicated, like an uneven and rough surface is. It's extremely highly detailed, right? And it's got undulations, and it's made out of dust, and the dust is made out of, you know, atoms at the finest level of resolution. Well, you can go even finer than that. It's very complicated, any surface. Now, when you tile it, you simplify it, right? Because each tile, in some sense, is homogeneous. That's sort of what makes it a tile. It's one piece. So you take this thing that's extremely complex and you put a simpler representation on top of it. And so one of the things I've learned about people is that we all tile the whole cosmos. So you have a model of the entire universe. Now you think, well, how can you? Because what the hell do you know? And the answer is, you use really big tiles. So imagine what you know about Serbia. You know, you maybe you know a lot about Serbia, but I'm going to assume you don't.
My wife's from Kosovo, so I know a fair bit.
Okay,
yeah.
so but then you think you know a fair bit. It's like, well, maybe you could identify where it is located on a map. If you had a map, you probably couldn't draw the map.
I disagree with a few people about what Serbia is and isn't on a map, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's also a problem. But imagine, you could probably point to Serbia on a map, but then I could say, well, could you draw that map without looking at a map? Could you draw a map of Europe accurately without looking at it? Now, maybe you could, but most people certainly can't. But they could point to it. Mm-hmm. So imagine people have a representation of the whole world, but it's really, 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 really low resolution. It's sort of, you can see this if you get people to do something like, well, do you know what a helicopter is? It's like, yes. Can you draw one? Mm-hmm. So they draw it. It looks like a 3-year-old drew a helicopter. It's like it's got rotors. It's like 4 parts: rotors, ball, stick, ball. That's a helicopter. It's like, no, it's not. Especially not if it's a military helicopter. I think you have to, for a military helicopter to fly, you need 35 hours of maintenance for every hour it's in the air. And the reason for that is, well, they're rocks, like they're a solid piece of metal, you know, they just plummet, they don't fly, and keeping those things in the air is really complicated, and you have to know the helicopter in unbelievably great detail in order to actually make it work. And so when you say you know what a helicopter is, you might say, well, what do you mean? And your answer is something like, well, I know one well enough so that if I walk by it, it doesn't explode. It's something like that. And so your representation is good enough so that in your normal course of affairs, you can use it to navigate through the world. And that's how you adjudicate your knowledge. And so if you never go to Russia, you can have a really low resolution representation of Russia, and it doesn't matter. Now, the devil's in the details, let's say. You talked about a nuanced conversation. Well, let's say you're an environmentalist. So that's what you say, and that's a claim to moral virtue. And you say, okay, well, what do you mean you're an environment? Well, I think we should serve the planet. It's like, well, what do you mean the planet? And, well, what do you think the big issue is? Well, it's carbon. It's like, well, is it really? What about overfishing? What about despeciation? What about soil degradation? What about the idea that if you made people richer, they would become more environmentally conscious, and so maybe the best way to clean the planet is by making the poor people rich, which, by the way, seems to be the case, and so on. And what about setting aside marine protected areas? What about how much land should we preserve on Earth so that we can grow crops optimally but still maintain the natural balance? How would you define ecodiversity? Do you know how many species are propagating compared to how many are going extinct? And the answer is, you don't know any of that. And so that also means you're not an environmentalist. It also means that I've just shone a light on your claim that you're an environmentalist, showing you that it's unbelievably shallow and just a false virtue signaling flag. And so you can't have a nuanced conversation, because what you do is you tell people, you say to people, You're using a very big tile to cover an awful lot of snakes, like thousands of them or hundreds of thousands of them. And I'll just lift up the tile and show you the snakes. And some of those snakes are you and your pretension that your tile actually constitutes knowledge, which it doesn't. And so if you have a nuanced conversation and you show that you understand the details, at least to some degree, then you're a threat to the integrity of the person's worldview. So you replace that unity with a complex and anxiety-provoking multiplicity, and you also illuminate their pretension to moral virtue. And so it's no bloody wonder they don't like you. It's like, oh, you said, this is way more complex than you think. You have no entitlement to moral virtue as a consequence of your low-resolution claim.